This
There we go.
conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for listening to us just kind of banter about nonsense for the last few minutes if you joined earlier. My name is Gwen Kozlowski, and you've gotten a bunch of emails from me about logging on to the Backyard Woods course. So I apologize in advance if it becomes too much. Please just let me know. But we are appreciative of having you on this morning, and so thankful for Chittenden County Forester Ethan Tapper to be here today to answer some questions. One of the benefits of the Backyard Woods course is that it's online and you're able to do it self-paced, whatever works for you. But typically we've had an in-person walk where you could ask your questions to a real live person in real time. And we weren't able to provide that this spring for obvious reasons. So as an alternative, we have these live webinar sessions, which, comes with some ups and downs with trying to use technology and all that kind of stuff. But we hope that we see it as a useful tool, and we don't have a presentation today, so this is going to be more of an open dialogue, and Ethan is a wealth of information and knowledge to be able to share with everyone here. So with that, Ethan, maybe I'll just pass it to you for some opening remarks, and folks can either chat their questions after he's done speaking, or you can unmute yourself and ask them yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. If you haven't, I see some familiar names out there, but if you haven't interacted with county foresters in the past, basically what we are is the way that the state supports the management of privately owned forest lands in Vermont. And so we work for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. We don't work for county government. It's really an interesting job for a whole bunch of different reasons. One of them is that like forests completely support and frame our lives. And so Vermont is 75% forested, and 80% of those lands are owned by private individuals and families. They're not owned by, like out west, where you'd see much more of public land ownership in the mix. Here in Vermont, it's pretty much just people. And so what that means is that all of these incredible benefits that we're getting from forests, like living in a beautiful state and having maple syrup and having forest-based recreational opportunities like mountain biking and skiing, even down to clean air and clean water and habitat for our wildlife and all of these other benefits that are like supporting our quality of life and that are also supporting our like physical ability as humans to live here, are ultimately provided in Vermont by forests. And the vast majority of those forests owned by private individuals. And so it's really, really important that we manage those privately owned forested lands well. And that's basically what the county foresters do. It's this like incredible sort of experiment where it's like, can we provide all of these public benefits from this privately owned forested land, people making individual decisions and somehow come out in a good place that's supportive of what we want to do, how we want to do right by our forests and our wildlife, and be part of this bigger global picture, which is also really important to think about. And so in service of that, I say we do basically 4 things. And so if you were to talk to each of the 13 county foresters, you would probably get 13 different answers about what our job actually is. It's different in different counties, but in my county, the biggest part of it, the biggest individual part of it is probably the current use program, also called the Use Value Appraisal Program. That's a tax abatement program for landowners who own more than 25 acres of land. And they basically you get a big tax break. And in exchange for that, you have to follow a forest management plan, which is developed by a licensed consulting forester and approved by the county forester and monitored by the county forester. And you can't subdivide or develop your land without paying basically a penalty. There's a lien on your property. And it's actually, the current use program is this like really, really important part of how Vermont's working landscape stays working and how we protect our forests from development and conversion to other stuff. And also how we prevent people from being taxed off their land, right? Making it so that it's affordable for everybody to own land, and you don't have to be wealthy to afford the taxes on your land. And so that's the biggest individual part. In Chittenden County, that's less of a big part of my job as it is in some of the other counties where they have many, many more enrollments in that program, and that's basically like their entire job in some counties, or a very huge, like way outsized portion of their job. The second thing is that, and I know that many of you are in this program because you have less than 25 acres of forested land. Landowners who have any amount of forest can just call me, and we'll just go out and take a walk, and we'll talk about what's going on in your forest, how to be a good steward of your forest, how to address maybe some challenges that are going on in your forest, or help manage your forest in a way that is also in line with best practices, but also in line with what you are interested in and how you interact with your forest. So that's number two. The third part is that we're also obligated to help municipalities, towns, manage their municipal forests, town forests in some way. So in my town, in my county, there's about 13 of these. There's more, but about 13 active town forests covering about 4,200 acres. And I can't actively manage all those, but I do help the towns manage them, and then engage in like different sort of concentrated periods of time developing forest management plans and doing demonstration forest management and helping use those town forests to both be really good public land resources for those towns and the community beyond, and then also use them to demonstrate really good management. And then finally, the fourth part is that what I call just sort of answering the question of how do we elevate the quality of forest management and the health of forests in our county. And so that's the part where you can also do that within those other three parts. We're sort of building a culture of like responsible forest management, responsible forest stewardship, helping people be informed and engaged, good landowners of their forested land, but also just be creative about like the threats, the threats in your county, the opportunities that there are to improve the quality of forest management in your county. And that's when you get to do like really fun stuff like this. And so my goal, a lot of times the really meaningful work that I do is just out on people's land, interacting with them and looking at stuff and sort of helping them understand how to look at their forest and what they can do that's positive for the forest, while sort of making it also a resource for them. And in many cases, I do what I call like the triage, which is, there's a million different things you could do to be a good land steward, but like what's like the one most important thing you could do? And then what's like the second most important thing you could do? And if you have time, what other thing could you do? Or, what are these different opportunities? What stuff to check out? What is, what's really striking me about your forest as a person who walks through a lot of them? And so this will be in some way an attempt to sort of get at that. And I would also say that if you're in my county, if you're in another county, you've got a county forester, and it's part of their job to help you figure out how to manage your forested land well. And they will, as soon as we're allowed to go out with people on their land again, I'm sure that they would be delighted to set up an appointment with you to walk your forest. But if you're in my county, you can call me also. And we'll do the same. But right now, I sort of would like to give you this opportunity to ask me some questions that are specific to your forest. Through this course, we're providing a lot of general information. And so ask me questions that are specific things you're wondering about, and I'll answer them as best I can. And so with that, so if you look on the top right of your screen, there's a little speech bubble. That's the chat box that you can click on. You can type your questions in there, or you can go down to your mic, which is on sort of the bottom bar, and click on that, and that will unmute you, and then you can ask me a question as well.
I actually wanted to start with Mark Frederick, who joined us. He had posted a comment on our online discussion forum. So Mark, forgive me, I think you're based in Huntington, and correct me if I'm wrong. But so over the years, oh yes, he is in Huntington. So he's in your county.
I love
so let's see. Over the years, before we bought our property, it has been substantially cleared of almost all but hemlocks. Now they seem fragile and susceptible to water erosion, but also to blow down due to the flat, shallow root base. We would like to clear some trees to open the canopy for sunlight, but someone told me this can change things for the surrounding trees and affect them negatively, such as opening them up to new angles for wind damage. Confused, I thought thinning competing trees would be inherently good. Can you
Yeah,
speak to that?
yeah, that's a big question. So like part of that, part of what I try and impart to almost anybody that I work with is an idea of how forests actually work. And so we have this idea that a well-managed forest or a healthy forest is one that looks clean to us. So it's like this very tidy, orderly, evenly spaced trees, nothing on the ground. Every tree is healthy, you know, no understory or anything like that. Whereas what's really the case, and we know this from studying old growth forests, the way that forests naturally grow and develop makes them messy, makes them look messy to us. And what that really is, what you're seeing is like diversity, complexity, irregularity, which are all really important things for forests to be healthy over time. And so forests are systems, and within that system, as the system changes, the system is supposed to change over time. They're dynamic. And so trees die. You know, some trees, like the fact that a tree has died does not mean that your forest is unhealthy, or that there's some, you know, issue that needs to be addressed. For trees dying is actually profound and exciting, and it's a way that our forests become more diverse over time, which actually will make them more resilient to climate change and more resilient to these like invasive exotic pests and diseases, and more diverse, so providing a greater or wider array of wildlife habitat and opportunities for wildlife, stuff like that. So what I would say is that you know, one of the roles that we can take, so for instance, talking about like you've got a shallow rooted hemlock, right, that are falling over. There are a bunch of ways that you could address this. One of the ways you could address it is by not addressing it and just letting it happen and understanding that those trees are going to fall over. And then what will follow that will be this sort of natural regeneration, right, which will go through multiple stages that we call succession. It's a succession of different tree species, a succession of different developmental stages in the forest, all of which are valuable not just because they are the precursors to new trees growing, but which actually have their own intrinsic benefits, and they have wildlife habitat benefits and all these other things. So that will happen no matter what. I'm really interested in this idea of managing actively in a way that's like positive and altruistic. So in my forest, I'm actually intentionally driving those natural disturbances. And what that means is just basically trying to create, using the cutting of trees, trying to create a more diverse forests. And we have this huge we have a lot of work cut out for. We have our work cut out for us. We have a lot of work ahead of us because our forests are, compared to old growth forests, relatively like monolithic and not very diverse. Because in the 1800s, we cleared about 80% of our landscape, and our forests are sort of still recovering from that. Whereas the forests that preceded that clearing have been developing as systems for thousands and thousands of years. And so, one positive role that we can do is actually driving disturbances like that. And you know, we can also generate like firewood and wood, which if we're doing it in a responsible way is this local renewable resource that I think we can be really excited about. But yeah, when you drive these natural disturbances, like to your point about, am I going to be exposing them to more wind throw? Yeah, you will, which is also okay. And if you actually look at, you know, they've done these studies of like, how do these disturbances move across the landscape? It's fascinating. And there's actually all these different types of forest management that try to like model and like take the cues from these natural disturbances and the way they move across the landscape and the way that we intentionally manage trees. But like, so you'll get a little wind microburst or an ice storm or an insect outbreak or a disease outbreak or something like that. And so you'll basically get a little teeny pocket of dead trees. Now, the trees on the edge of that pocket are now exposed to wind throw, just like you say. And so over time, wind will come in there, you know, and ice and other stuff will come in there and knock down those trees. And what you'll see is that this gap will actually expand across the landscape over time. It'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And in each case, you're exposing the trees on the edge of that to falling over. Does that involve trees dying? Yes. Is that a big deal? Yes. But is it a totally bad thing? Of course not. And I think that one of the things I remember one time when I was in forestry school, I was like taking a walk with my mom during this big ice storm. I was at home for a holiday or something like that, and it was during this big ice storm, and you could hear trees like snapping and breaking. And at first I was like, whoa, this is really scary. And then I was like, this is exciting. I'm like, I wonder what's going to happen now as this forest, like these trees are dying, but the system is becoming more diverse before our eyes. Like stuff is happening, creating new opportunities for different species of trees to grow in different ways. And that all is synonymous, it's synonymous with like the death of individual trees, but then the health of the system. So anyway, so I'm really excited about actually providing opportunities for the forest to grow and change in that way. And sometimes, like if you've got thin soils that hemlock's growing on, it might just be that on that site, that's as big as hemlock can grow, and then it gets too big for its root system because the water table's high, and you can't support a really deep root system there, and then they fall over, and that's totally fine. And then the trees that are adjacent also fall over, also totally fine. And you can preemptively do that if you can get a sense for like how the trees are going to fall over. You can like drive that disturbance, and maybe you get a chance to pull some firewood out or some hemlock logs or something, or you can just let it happen. And now, finally, I know this is like a really long answer to a long question, but a much shorter question. As far as thinning individual trees, so so when a forest grows up, the first thing it does is, let's say you've got a blank slate. Let's say you've got an agricultural field that's reverting to forest. All these tree species and also shrub species and stuff like that will come into that area. And then after, let's say 10, 15, 20 years, they're all the same age. They're all about the same height, and they're competing with each other very aggressively, and their crowns are knit together. This is a phase called stem exclusion. And depending on the species, that phase where they're just like a single age class of trees competing with each other very aggressively, that can last like over 100 years. What most people think is old growth is actually like highly advanced stem exclusion phase. So just that an even aged forest that had just the trees have gotten very old on. And so naturally what's going to happen is the trees compete with each other. Some trees win, some trees lose. The trees that lose die, which is also fine. And then away you go. The benefit of thinning them proactively is that you will be alleviating the stress that's associated with that competition. So basically, and at the same time, again, you can like harvest some firewood or something like that. You can take these trees, which are very stressed out by having to like have these little crowns and like try and be, all the time growing up to outcompete their neighbors. And you can be basically putting your thumb on the scale for the healthiest trees in your forest to allow them to have more energy to deal with other stuff. So I think about it a lot, especially with climate change, because our forests are responding to and are about to be responding to an even greater degree, a lot of stress, like miscellaneous stress, climatic stress, and like these really intense natural disturbances. And so one way that we can be sort of altruistic and have sort of a symbiotic relationship with our forest is by alleviating some of those stresses to allow those trees to have more energy to respond to all the other stuff, all this other like unnatural, weird stuff that we're throwing at them. So I think that's the end of the answer to that multi-part question. Sorry if that was long.
No, that was really great. And Dew would like to unmute for a similar question about a tornado that went through Williston. Dew, do you have?
Yeah.
Are you there?
I'll bet I know what Dew's asking about. A few years ago, so there's a couple, and it seems like every few years we have like these big wind events. Now, I don't know, I haven't seen the research, so I don't know what's normal, but over a large period of time, like a century. But I do know that in Chittenden County, back in 2010, we had like a massive wind disturbance event where like all these trees blew down all over the place. I know that Williston was definitely pretty hard hit. parts of Richmond, Heinsberg, Jericho. So one of the really interesting things about that windstorm and about subsequent windstorms, there was another one in 2012. There was another one October, like Halloween 2017. So these are obviously really intense weather events. And even if it's a healthy tree, wind blows trees over. Sometimes that's just the way it works. But the effect of those wind disturbance events is also compounded in a sort of roundabout way by human activity. So talking about 80% of Vermont was cleared in the 1800s, and our forests, for the most part, most of Vermont's forests are like 60 to 100 years old. So again, they're still in that like early stage of development, that stem exclusion phase where they haven't had a chance to develop that much diversity. And so when I talk about diversity that I want to manage for in the forest, I'm talking about two different things. So I'm talking about species diversity, so the number of different tree species that are present in a forest, and we have about 50 species of native trees in Vermont. And I'm also talking about structural diversity. Structural diversity is the way that trees are growing, and what this basically means is having a bunch of different ages and sizes of trees in a given forest. And that's how old growth forests grow. They don't grow as this sort of monolithic even-age forest in most cases. In most cases, they're a mix of all different sizes and ages of trees, patches of young forest, patches of middle-aged forest, and all those different trees mixed together. So as a result of this agricultural abandonment, what we get is even-aged forest, because all those trees, right, they started at the same time. Instead of developing in a forest which has been just sort of doing its thing for thousands of years, they're developing, you know, over a very short period of time and haven't had a chance to become diverse yet, which they will. But also as a result of pasture abandonment, they are disproportionately stocked with certain species. And the main species that you're going to see is white pine, because white pine is really good at growing in fields for some reason, and because there was this trend in the early 1900s of planting these conifer plantations. So sometimes you'll see like red pine, Scots pine, Norway spruce, sometimes Japanese larch or European larch. And those were planted in that case, and sometimes you can see they're planted in rows. More often what you'll see is that it's just sort of these monocultures of these like really scraggy, gnarly, multi-stemmed white pine growing, you know, single age class. Again, that's like the only thing there. And in many cases, they're not even really growing on what we foresters would call a white pine site. So we would be like looking in, you know, prior to European settlement, we'd be looking for white pine on like deep, sandy, gravelly, well-drained soils, probably along like our big rivers and the shelves above them. We wouldn't be looking for them on a lot of the places where they're growing now, which is like shallow, wet soils. And the only reason they're growing there is because white pine is good at growing in old fields for a bunch of different reasons. So we have these big wind events, and in almost every case, the trees that these wind events are blowing over are like all white pine growing on wet soils and or these conifer plantations. And it's actually a really good testament to the importance of maintaining diversity in your forest, because if all your trees are the same thing or the same species, or they're all growing in the same way, we know that monocultures are unhealthy, right? Because one thing that specifically targets the one way that all the trees in your forest are growing, because they're the same species, they're the same age, is going to take out everything all at once. Whereas if it's a diversity of tree species, a diversity of tree sizes and ages, no one event is going to affect all of those trees at the same time. And so the forests that are diverse can be more stable over time. So as something happens, maybe you lose a bunch of trees in your overstory, maybe you have something else happen, you know, a disease affect one species of trees, or the emerald ash borer comes and affects all the ash trees. You have the tools, more tools in your toolkit, more options by having a diverse forest to respond to that. And so I think that a lot of people, like, if we had more diverse forests, or if we had forests that weren't directly related to old fields that have just been colonized with trees that are good at growing in old fields, the effect of those wind disturbances, I think, would actually be a lot more minor.
Ethan, so does it make sense to you that in my yard here in Williston, it looks like everything fell kind of in a straight line?
Yeah.
And certainly you're correct that the trees that fell did fall in a place where there was quite a bit of runoff from some higher up small vernal ponds. So
Yeah.
what happened which is so sad, is that I had a very nice maple sugaring path that got completely diverted as a result of losing about 30 monstrosities, 30 beautiful, tall trees that just landed like a domino, a
Hmm.
line of dominoes right down the hill.
Yeah, straight line winds, I mean, I can actually tell in the woods. It's kind of neat. One of the interesting things about our most recent big wind event, the 2017 one, is that our prevailing winds in Chittenden County are coming from the west, and this one went around and came in from the east. And so if the tops of the trees are pointing west, I know it was from the
Yeah,
2017 windstorm. If they're facing east, I know it's from a different windstorm.
very cool. Very cool. Well, I would look forward to having you come visit me sometimes.
Yeah, give me a call or an email, please.
Oh, yeah, definitively. Thank you.
All right, and moving on from disturbances, we've got an interesting question here from Lauren Bloom. How problematic are calorie pear trees, the decorative pear? I've read that they can be invasive in forests in some areas, but have not witnessed it to be a problem here in Vermont. There is one planted in our front yard from the previous homeowner, and I'm curious how important it is to remove it. It's a great question.
I actually don't know. Do you know, Gwen?
Yeah, they are considered invasive. It isn't much of a problem here in Vermont, but when you go to other states, you do see it. They're like lining highways and things. So I'll have to get back to you on the importance of removing it. It's not listed on VT invasives, but we don't recommend it in our urban and community forestry tree planting guide. We know that it does have invasive tendencies, but let me get back to you on that unless there's any other thoughts that you have, Ethan.
I don't think so. I mean, one of the interesting things about, well, in pears there are native pears as well, but most of our apples and our pears are actually non-native species. Like apples aren't native to here, but they're also non-invasive. And it's like the question of, it was really interesting of like what causes the trigger for something to become invasive. Like many of our, not many, but several of our native tree species are invasive elsewhere in the world, like red oak and black cherry and yellow birch are like apparently huge problems in Europe. And what causes something to become invasive and become something that we like really worry about versus just being non-native and being something like it would be an example like an apple, right, where it's in our woods and we're actually like, this is okay because it actually provides wildlife habitat and it's not actually aggressively outcompeting our native species.
Yeah, calorie pear definitely has tendencies that it takes over in some of the more mid-Atlantic states. So I'll get more information to you on that one. Tracy Sherbrooke had a great question, and I know, Mark, we've got another question on fungus, but this is an interesting one first on, is deer overbrowsing an issue in the forests of Vermont? One of our favorite topics here in the Backyard Woods course.
Yeah, I have become a little freaked out about deer browse in my time. I think when I was a consulting forester, it wasn't something that I was tuned into in the same way, but I certainly am now. And it basically is a problem usually in proportion to the coldness of where you are. So like up in the Northeast Kingdom, it's much less of a problem. But if you go down south just a little bit, if you go to the Catskills in New York, if you go to Massachusetts or Connecticut or Long Island, New York, or New Jersey, deer is like a major conservation challenge that people have. And basically, so the problem, there's all these other problems. Like when they get really bad, there's all these tick-borne disease issues, and people can't grow stuff in their garden, and they have these massive deer car collision rates. But the ecological problem is that deer browse trees, particularly in the wintertime, and that they like to browse some trees more than others. So in many cases, like in Vermont, what'll happen is that if you have an overabundance of deer, they'll go in and they'll browse all your little red oaks and all your little yellow birch and all your little sugar maple and your white ash, and they will leave certain species. So like they'll leave American beech, they'll leave hawthorn beam, they'll leave, on the case of my land in the Winooski River Valley, they'll leave witch hazel, and they'll leave invasive exotic species like buckthorn and honeysuckle and stuff like that. And so it ultimately constitutes a threat to forest diversity, which again, forest diversity we can sort of think of as being synonymous with forest health, and anything that threatens the diversity of our forest is a problem for forest health. And so, you know, we have a problem here in Vermont. So in 2018, the Department of Fish and Wildlife acknowledged that in their antlerless recommendation, they acknowledged that deer overpopulated in a bunch of different places in the state. The Champlain Valley in Chittenden County is one of those places. Other places include the Connecticut River Valley, all the way on up to the northern part of the state, and very, very much so in Bennington County, places like that. Our overpopulation is not nearly as bad as those other states. So in other states, you're talking about, you know, sometimes on the order of 100, 200 deer per square mile. And here we're probably talking about, you know, in Chittenden County, the worst it would be, I know at Shelburne Farms, reportedly, it's 40 per square mile, which is the highest number I've ever heard of in Vermont. We probably want it to be about 20 per square mile, and probably in a lot of our county, we're talking 25 to 30 deer per square mile-ish, which is still too much. And I see the effects of deer browse absolutely all the time. And so, but the benefit, and this is also true for other things. So this is also true for invasive exotic plants and diseases and development and the threat of forest conversion and loss. We don't have to imagine what it would be like if this problem got really bad. We can just go south and you can see what it's like, where deer is a major conservation challenge, like one of the biggest ones that they deal with. And they're going through all these incredibly drastic actions, like hiring snipers and doing these massive deer culls, and like having to fence in enormous areas so that no deer can get to them, just so they can regenerate species of forest. They have a problem in the southern states that they call forest disintegration, which is really dire, and it is. And basically what that is the deer population is so high that the forest developmental processes are halted, and that disturbance continues to occur. So like those hemlock trees, like at your place, Mark, keep on falling over, but no regeneration occurs because it is all eaten by deer. And so that's really, really scary. At the same time, so there's a bunch of reasons why the deer population is on the rise. Our hunter numbers are crashing. So we, you know, I guess going back further, the apex predators of deer 300 years ago were wolves and catamounts. The eastern catamount was declared extinct in 2018, and the wolves were, both of them were extirpated from the state in the late 1800s because we put bounties on them and destroyed their habitat. And deer actually at that time, prior to European settlement, weren't even really in this. They were in small populations in the state, but our primary ungulates were caribou and a species of forest elk called an eastern elk, which is now also extinct. And deer really moved in after being reintroduced in the late 1800s, and especially from the 60s to the 80s, they became very overpopulated. And then we lowered the population, and there was this whole social upheaval called the deer wars around that, and basically their numbers have then re-increased due to a couple different things. A big part of that is that our hunter numbers are crashing. So in lieu of those apex predators, the apex predator of deer is humans. And we have half as many hunters now as we did in the 1970s. Demographic data tells us that in 10 years, we'll have half as many as we do now. And so that is really scary. And I actually, I hunted when I was a kid, but started hunting as an adult, basically because I felt obligated to do my part as an apex predator of this animal that I know if we don't do that, they become very overpopulated. And it's a huge threat to forest diversity. Also on the rise is posted land. So deer are not stupid, and they can very quickly will alter their behavior when hunting season comes around and move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. And so areas of posted land become essentially refuges for deer that people can't access. And so for a lot of people who are not used to hunting or uncomfortable with hunting, what I'll advise them to do, and really don't want to have it just open to anybody on their land, what I'll advise them to do is call it hunting by permission only, and then put your information on there and be like active on responding to people's inquiries, because then you know exactly who's in there. They, a lot of times, the hunters that you do allow are like a huge asset. I have someone who hunts on my land in Bolton. who I consider this incredibly important management tool. He tells me when other people are like, roughing up my roads using ATVs, and he tells me when there's other people hunting on the land that I didn't give permission to, stuff like that. And I think it can really, really be an asset. And then, if there's something going on, if you're like, hey, I want to take a walk in this area and I want to know if you're hunting there, you can there's a person you can like call or shoot a text or something, and you know exactly who's going to be there. But hunting, a lot of these things, there are active measures that we can take that are not always like pleasant. Like many of us may not have grown up hunting or may have an aversion to thinking about that, but actually can be something that we can genuinely do that is genuinely positive. Hunting deer is one of those things, and especially hunting antlerless deer, hunting does, because killing a doe has a much more direct correlation to lowering the population of deer than killing a buck.
I know that's an interesting way for people to think about it too. And Andrea Shortsleeve did a full hour presentation on deer browse in Vermont, and I'd be happy to share out that video link as well if you're just looking for a little bit even more information if you want to consider that further. So I'll be sure to send that link out.
Yeah. Oh, let me just one more thought. There's sort of a few different things that you can do to if you're seeing, you can start to see the effects of deer browse. Sometimes it's really easy because you see these little bonsai trees that have just they're all gnarled and twisted, and it's because they've just been browsed again and again and again and again by deer. When areas are heavily browsed and you're farther removed from like the initial browsing, or it's been happening for a longer period of time, it can be hard to tell. But one of the ways you can tell sometimes is that in the understory of your forest, you just don't have a lot of diversity. So a lot of times it'll be like pure beech. That's what we see a lot of times. It's just pure beech, nothing else, which is an indicator that beech browse has been happening, or deer browse has been happening for a long time. They browsed all the other stuff. They didn't browse the beech. In the course of the management work that you do, if you're interested in managing actively, what you can do to prevent deer browse is, number one, kill the deer, especially antlerless deer, or allow someone else to access your land. I was looking for bow hunters to take antlerless deer off my land. I posted on Front Porch Forum and got like a gajillion responses in a day. So there are people who are looking for places to go hunt, and you can vet them and have conversations with them and get, pick someone you trust. If you are harvesting, one thing that you can do is do not, when you fell a tree and you cut the top and the branches off the tree, don't cut all that stuff up and lay it on the ground so it looks neat. You're actually not doing that. There's no reason to do that other than purely that we think it looks good. It actually diminishes the ecological benefits of that stuff that you're leaving behind, which has ecological benefits. And also on my forest, so I'll be working in an area, cutting trees, and then I'll leave those tops high, so unlopped, and it looks crazy, but you're creating these little areas where deer can't physically access, creating these little structural barriers where deer can't like actually stick their head in, and hopefully creating some opportunities for those seedlings to get past the deer browse.
Excellent, thank you for that information. All right, we've got a few other questions on different topics. Drew was wondering that he wants to take full advantage of the woods on my property, but have not identified all the boundary lines. What are resources available to locate these property markers in the woods? And Mark had responded asking for the town office for all public records on the property for the original service with compass bearings and distances. Do you have any other suggestions to add to that, Ethan?
Yeah, so I would say more important than the deed. So the deed will say like, will describe the boundary line. The compass, like you could probably not run a compass bearing with the equipment with just a compass that is accurate enough that you would want to call that your property boundary line. What you could do is get a sense for what the boundary is marked by. So it'll say like a stone fence or a stream or a road or a wire fence or something like that, blazes. And so you can get a sense for what to look for out there. What is more useful sometimes is to find a survey. So you can go to the town office, find out if there's a survey of your property at any point, and also find out if there are surveys of adjacent properties. because they might feature, one of your lines, something like that. And that will tell you, like, on the survey, usually it'll say this line is marked by barbed wire, or there's an iron pin at this corner, or a pile of stones at this corner, or a stone fence on this boundary line, or this boundary line goes along a river or something like that. So it'll tell you what the boundary line is. And then what I would do is, there are a bunch of different apps, free apps that you can use that overlay the town tax map over like an aerial photo or something like that, and show you where you are in relation to the town tax map. The two different apps that I've seen people use the most often as a landowner is, they're two hunting apps. One's called OnX Hunt, and one is called Hunt Stand. And both of those will have those town tax map boundaries, which are notoriously imperfect. So don't just like say, well, my blue dot's on this boundary line, I'm on my boundary, but it'll get you in the neighborhood where you can find existing evidence. I do not recommend looking at your deed, taking a compass bearing on what your deed says, and then just flagging that and saying this is my line, and then just painting or blazing trees on the line. You should not be doing that. And so the only people who should be actually establishing new boundary line, what we call monumentation, is a licensed surveyor. But you can, as a landowner, mark existing monumentation. So if you go out there with your hunt stand and you're like, okay, and I have a copy of my survey says that there's barbed wire marking this line. You go out and you're like on that line, it's running in exactly the right direction, and it's barbed wire just like it's supposed to be. That's a line that you can then mark with some flagging tape or something like that. That's how I would approach it.
Can you, you said Hunt Stand, and what was the other one?
OnX Hunt. So
X.
OnX Hunt.
Okay.
That's
great.
probably the more popular one.
Okay. Great. And then Mark had another question, which you may or may not be able to answer without visiting the property. They see a lot of moss and mushrooms, who knows, affecting the tree bark sometimes all the way up. Some of our birch and beech just look sick in general. Is this normal?
Yeah, I mean, so beech is sort of a special case. Beech has a disease complex that we call beech bark disease, which started up in Nova Scotia, I think in the 40s. And it's basically this complex of this fungus and this little scale insect. Most beech trees get it, and most beech trees die from it. Some beech trees are resistant. The beech trees that are resistant, you'll be able to tell because their bark will look like beech bark is supposed to look, which is what I learned as like elephant skin bark, this perfectly smooth gray bark. It's beautiful. And beech trees that have beech bark disease will have these like black pock marks, and it'll look like cracky and gross, and definitely not smooth. So that could be what's going on with the beech trees. Birch, especially white birch, birch is a short-lived species. And a lot of times, you'll see the fact that you have any white birch in your woods, you'll have a bunch of white birch. It's all the same age. White birch can't grow except for in a big opening. So what that means is at some point through logging, or it was a field or some other thing, there was like a big, like acres opening, and all the white birch that you have is probably growing from as a result of that, whatever happened, if it was a hurricane or logging or whatever. All the white birch is probably the same age, and it all usually will start to decline at the same time. And so that could be what's also going on with the birch. Most of those, so beech bark disease is an invasive disease. It's exotic, not native, not co-evolved with our beech trees. But most of our like fungi, insects, stuff like that, like people see like woodpecker damage on the tree and they'll be like, well, woodpeckers are putting holes in my trees. Those are symptoms, they are not the cause. So like in many cases, a tree is just starting to decline. And as it declines, other species get in there, like some of our what we call saprophytic mushrooms that break down wood, like oyster mushrooms, turkey tail, stuff like that. Or, other stuff like, or there'll be insects, invertebrates, arthropods that will colonize trees that are unable to defend themselves because they're declining for other reasons. Maybe they're just old, maybe they're on a bad site, maybe they've just lost the competition with their neighbor. And the woodpecker is not killing those trees. It's a symptom of the fact that those trees are declining, and it's looking for those bugs, which are also a symptom. And so in most cases, I say, don't worry about it. Of course, there are weird cases like beech bark disease and emerald ash borer, which are sort of outside the normal range of variability for how forests and trees grow and how they die. But for the most part, those mushrooms and mosses and stuff like that are just additional normal parts of how forests grow.
Excellent. So Tracy had another question about critters. We have hemlocks in much of our forest, and every winter there are many, many snipped branches on the ground. Is this squirrels? Is this damaging, or is it good for the trees?
Is that hemlock trees?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it could be a bunch of different things. Could be squirrels, chipmunks, or porcupines. So porcupines also really like hemlock, and a lot of times they will. They're basically, with squirrels, they're nibbling off the end of those twigs because they're trying to eat the buds at the end of the twigs, and so they're nibbling off the end so that they can turn them and eat them. Porcupines are also strongly associated with hemlock trees, and they basically just eat like bark. Yeah, it's like the trees would probably be happier in some way if that didn't happen, but again, it's just sort of like, I don't see it as being like a apocalyptic, really scary thing. It's just something that happens. And it's a normal part of how forests grow and develop. Those are native animals. These are native trees. They've been doing it to each other for thousands of years. And so I think it's nothing to worry too much about.
Great. And Lauren has a question. Do you recommend any topicals if a desired sapling gets a surface wound, like a lawnmower or deer rub injury? I've heard everything from do nothing and watch it to cover it with a clay-based paste to prevent insect invasion to latex painting of the wound.
I have a really funny relationship with what I would call town trees. And so it depends. Like, I'm not an arborist, so I mostly think about the work that I do as the manipulation of a system, and I'm not usually protecting like individual trees. And so in the woods, if a tree gets a wound, I'm like, oh darn. But that tree, and maybe the tree will be okay, and maybe it'll develop a cavity, which will be like a place where something can nest, or like a flying squirrel can live, or all these different things can happen that are actually really positive from trees that are not necessarily traditionally healthy. As far as like a tree that's in your yard that you planted or something like that, trying to keep my idea, just as a forester and the way I think about forests, me trying to keep an individual tree alive just like makes my head hurt, because in the forest I'm just like, you like, a tree dies, another tree grows. We have this amazing regenerative process in our forests, which is just like any hole is just filled by this diversity of tree species, and we don't have to worry about it. And so, I create or one is created naturally, or I create like a 1/4 acre opening, and then 5 years later there's 10,000 trees growing in there. It's this like incredibly cool thing. But so I don't know, as far as keeping trees alive, individual trees, I'd have to refer you to an arborist because I'm not sure. But in the woods, I just wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, and I would be hesitant to put any paint or anything on a particular tree, as we say, trees seal, they don't heal. So putting something on them might prevent them from actually doing their job and actually producing those cells that close over that wound. So I would be very hesitant of any product that you actually put on a tree. That's a little bit of an old school way that they dealt with wounds, and I think there's research to prove that that is not ideal. Again, I'm not a certified arborist, but that's usually what we recommend to folks. But I could refer you to some certified arborist lists that you can consult.
I think that's what I did a walk with Warren Spinner, who used to be the city arborist of Burlington. I think he was remarking on that they used to do all kinds of stuff. They used to put cement in holes in trees, and do all kinds of stuff, and now they let the tree take care of it and understand that, like, sunlight's the best medicine for this stuff. Like, trees, just their natural processes of healing are better.
Great. And let's see. Our next question, is from Dew again. Could you tell us where we could visit some old growth forest in Vermont?
Boy, there aren't any that I know of. Well, that's not true. There aren't any that I'm sure of that are in Chittenden County. There are pockets that I've seen that that have the look and that we think are. But in Vermont, it's not very much. I mean, it's thousands of acres statewide, which seems like a lot, but it's split up onto all these little tiny fragments. I know that I think Bristol Cliffs Wilderness Area has some, but I don't think they have it mapped where it is. One place that I really like to look at is Williams Woods in Charlotte on East Thompson's Point Road, which is a property that's owned by the Nature Conservancy. And it has an area where it has maybe been logged, but was never cleared for pasture. And there are trees in there that have been cored, and we know are, got their start sometime in the 1600s. And there's really, really big trees, and it's also like looks crazy and messy. So I went out there with a group of from a senior center, and it was really funny because we walked through the first area of forest, which had obviously been a field in the last 80, 100 years. And it was, in that like stem exclusion phase. So like not very much in the understory, all the trees sort of evenly spaced, looks really nice and tidy. And people were like, oh, this is good, and then we like it's unmissable, like hit the area that is supposed to be old growth. And one person from the group said, oh, I don't like that. And the reason was because it just started to look crazy and messy. And there's like dead trees on the ground, and there was like all different sizes and ages of trees, and some parts were like really thick with young trees, and there was tip up, so that as trees tip up, right, they pull up their root system with this big blob of soil and stuff, which is actually a really important process of mixing soils and exposing mineral soil, which allows different species to grow. And anyway, so it was not traditionally nice looking, but really important for people to show that, because one of the reasons, like, I really believe in responsible, ecological, regenerative forest management, but forest management is judged on an unrealistic standard sometimes. So it's like also people are, when they think of logging or forest management, they're thinking of like clear cutting in the West Coast and like mudslides, all this, plantation forestry, all this forestry that we don't do here anyway. But they're also saying, well, I saw an area that was logged and it looked really messy. Well, it's supposed to look messy. And the fact that it looks messy might be actually more indicative of forest health than a forest that you think looks really tidy. And so understanding that forests are supposed to look like that is really, really important to helping people understand how to manage them responsibly.
Excellent. And I did put in a link to the VPR's Brave Little State question. They did, does Vermont have any any patches of old growth forest?
Yeah.
And they work with ecologist Bob Zano. And I think they mentioned a few more places. The Silvio Conti Wildlife Refuge has some old growth patches. Is there as well.
Yeah, there's like a lot of old growth that's not very impressive because it's at high elevations and the trees are little, but they're old. The what old growth looks like varies tremendously from site to site. The other place that I was going to say that I haven't verified but looks a lot like old growth is if you ever go into the area of the Huntington Gorge. There's some in which is on Dugway Road and between Richmond and Huntington. I
don't think you can get there right now.
Yeah, well, you can only go from the south. Yeah, you can only go from the Jonesville side. They have some hemlock forest. It's also a really good place to swim. And if you swim to around there, there's property that's owned by the River Conservancy, I believe, and the Richmond Land Trust. So it's public or allows for public access. And there is forests that look like old growth hemlock forest to me.
And can you mention the name of the place in Charlotte again?
Williams Woods. On East Thompson's Point Road, managed by the Nature Conservancy. The information you'll find out, maps and stuff, will be out through the Nature Conservancy.
Okay, great. I'll put a link in the chat next for that. And then there was a question from Martha. What should I do with the plantation of pines on my land? 50 trees, all about 100 to 150 feet tall.
Wow, those are really tall.
That's a big question.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends. So like a lot of times with those plantations, we want diversity within our forests, and we also want diversity across the landscape. So it could be that, that's not a lot of trees. That's like less than an acre probably, and it could be that those trees are still growing healthily, or we want to retain those for a little bit longer. So you can continue to to thin those trees. So thinning of a forest just means basically conducting that selection process. Remember that stem exclusion phase, all those trees are competing with each other very aggressively. Periodically their crowns knit together, and basically just by taking your healthiest trees and freeing them from competition around the crown, cutting less healthy trees whose crowns are touching their crowns, you can allow the healthier trees to expand their crowns and be ultimately healthier, more productive, faster growing. And so that's always an opportunity. And with an acre, I don't think you need to think about, that could be like a really cool diversity feature on your landscape, contrasted with other areas that are maybe more diverse natural forests. If you wanted to make that forest more diverse, and a lot of times what I'm thinking about is sort of breaking down these even-aged forests into forests which are more like old-growth forests, into like from an orderly forest to sort of a more diverse, complex, irregular forest. What I'll start to do is just to start driving natural or simulation natural disturbances in that area. So what I would do is start cutting pockets of trees, start cutting individual trees, and just, it's a hard thing to make yourself do kind of mentally, but I think about it as traditional forestry, like old school forestry, plantation forestry, is all about just maintaining order and regularity and uniformity, and that's like the virtue. And then when you're done, it's this really satisfying thing because it looks so neat. I'm trying to actively break that down and to create disorderliness, right? As it applies to these things, it actually is not really disorderly, but it's the appearance of taking order and converting it into something that is less obviously orderly. But the way you do that is by cutting individual trees, cutting pockets of trees, pockets of several trees together, anywhere in size to like a quarter of an acre or something like that, and allowing those areas to regenerate naturally. And when they regenerate naturally, they're going to regenerate to this diverse mix of species. And then over time, a long period of time, like decades, you can continue to build off those pockets that you've created and continue to expand them. And then eventually what you'll get is a diverse forest comprised of native species. If you were to cut all those trees at once, you would take this even-aged forest and you would just create another even-aged forest, right? And it would be better because it would be, instead of being, dominated by a single species of tree, it would be dominated probably by multiple different species of native trees because they weren't planted. But it would still be even-aged. And so what I would do is do it sort of in stages.
Great, and we are just about at 11 o'clock, but one last question I thought we could end on is from Patrick for any recommendation on Eastern Forest Field Guides. I put in the chat box the Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees of the Northeast by Mark McCullough. Any other suggestions, Ethan?
That's my favorite. The book Bark by Michael Wotek is good. And I should also plug, I've got a YouTube channel, and on it I've done a few different tree ID presentations, one for kids, and then a couple longer webinars for adults, which are recorded and they're up there. And then I have a couple of videos about identifying individual different tree species. One of the things I really like to do when I go out with landowners on their land and they really want to know about tree species is like to do, again, what I would call the triage. So it'd be like, you don't have to learn all of the tree species. Almost all your species will usually be like one of these 5 species. So just learn those 5 species. And in Vermont, it's also really important to understand that. So we have 50 native species of trees. In a field guide, which are regional, not just specific to Vermont, they'll have like hundreds of species of trees. You don't need to know all those. The top 10 tree species in Vermont, which I can actually bring up that list of what that is. Hold on one second.
Yeah, let's bring up that.
The top 10 species of trees in Vermont account for 85% of all the trees. So like if you really want to just learn those 10 and just assume that almost all the trees you're going to see are part of or are one of those 10 species. And I'm just going to tell you what they are in one second. So they are sugar maple, red maple, hemlock, eastern hemlock, eastern white pine, yellow birch, American beech, white ash, red spruce, balsam fir, and paper birch. And maybe I can even just plunk that list right in the chat box.
Oh, that'd be great. I was trying to capture them. Let's see, I'm also putting in the link to your YouTube channel. Oh, perfect.
So those are the top 10 trees. So like one of the really important things is that you don't have to learn them all. You just have to learn, like what I would do is you learn the most common ones really well, and then you can add other ones when you're like, this isn't any of these, what is it? And then, think about adding to your list sort of by process of inclusion or exclusion. It will massively enrich the work that you do in your forest, because it goes from just you're like, in the same way that if you don't know birds at this time of year, which I know some birds, but I don't know like birds like a lot of people I work with know birds. You're like listening and you're like, the birds are singing, cool, but then you start to learn these individual trees and you're like, oh, that's a chestnut-sided warbler, and that's a black-throated blue warbler, and that's a black-throated green, and that's a veery, and like it massively will enrich your interaction with what you're hearing, in the same way that when people go out in the woods and they're like, look at all these trees, and when I go out in the woods, I'm like, wow, look at the way that all these different species of trees are growing and sort of behaving, and the way that this forest is developing, and just developing a much more rich understanding of what's going on in your woods. In Vermont, again, like diversity is the name of the game. And so for you to be a good land steward and even be able to like interact intelligently with all of the different resources that there are about managing forests, you need to be able to identify trees to some degree, because they're all going to be, you have to treat them all differently. They're all really different. So that's really, really important.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thank you so much, Ethan, for your whirlwind tour of our forests here in Vermont. We went from everything from disturbance to top 10 trees to everything. So thank you all for bringing your questions. This was really helpful. I think people, even who weren't able to join us live, will appreciate this recording. So thank you all for your questions, and Ethan for your knowledge. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll share the recording soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Bye now.